This episode is brought to you by Brilliant. Hi, welcome to another episode of ColdFusion. How did a 1979 panel with David Attenborough result in this? It's a strange question, but hear me out. In the late 1970s, David Attenborough was having trouble entering China to film his documentaries. He decided to join a committee panel in China in order to change this. Attenborough just happened to ask a Chinese high-up official, Deng Xiaoping, what China was going to do about their rapidly growing population. In answering David's question, it was here, on this panel, that China's one-child policy would be revealed to the world. This policy decision would cascade into a myriad of problems, both demographic and economic. I've covered China's broader economic woes in a previous video, so check the link below if you haven't caught it yet. But as for our story, in China, there was now too few young people.
The world's most populous country has hit an historic turning point. Today, China announced its first population decline in 6 decades.
Government data shows the birth rate at a record low, with the fewest babies born last year since the founding of Communist China in 1949.
But things would only get worse in July of 2022, when a data leak showed that Chinese authorities have overcounted the population by over 100 million young people. China now has too many residential buildings and not enough buyers. With the real estate market about 30% of China's GDP and 70% of Chinese wealth tied up in the sector, I don't have to tell you that this is a big deal. At the center of the crisis is Evergrande, which was once one of China's largest property developers by sales. It had 1,300 real estate projects in over 280 cities in China, housing 12 million people. Yet the company is over $320 billion in debt, making it the world's most indebted real estate company. With the company filing for bankruptcy and some high-up officials being arrested, analysts fear that this could be China's Lehman Brothers moment. Since the Chinese economy is the second largest on the planet, it's not hard to see why a total real estate collapse would send shockwaves throughout the world. Now that we have all of this context, how bad will it get? To find out, let's take a deeper look into Evergrande itself.
You are watching ColdFusion TV.
Before we continue, I just want to introduce today's sponsor, Brilliant. A lot of the topics I cover on this channel may seem complicated to some, but now there's an easy and fun way to learn more about them. Brilliant's interactive courses on anything from computer science to physics make learning fun and easy. As I've mentioned before, I really like their Artificial Neural Networks course. I think that first principles understanding is important. It was a great way to brush up on the fundamentals of modern AI systems. If you want to brush up on your learning, either for leisure or in your professional career, you can get started for free for 30 days, and the first 200 people to sign up get 20% off an annual plan. Visit the URL brilliant.org/coldfusion to get started. Okay, so let's continue. Evergrande was more than a property developer. You might be surprised to know that they dipped their toes into far-reaching fields as far as EVs and theme parks. For example, Evergrande New Energy had ambitious goals to compete with Tesla in China and dominate the EV industry by 2025. They were planning 14 different car models and 5 million cars per year. Evergrande Spring produces bottled water and claimed to be China's largest water source. Evergrande also owned not 1, but 4 soccer teams, and they participated in China's professional league. Evergrande operated 15 theme parks under the name Fairyland, which aimed to beat Disneyland in both size and service. However, beneath the surface, these lofty adventures were funded by a pile of growing debt, but more on that later. Evergrande began as a small company in Guangzhou in 1996. They grew into a giant due to a lucky break that happened in the 1990s. Economic progress in China had lifted millions from poverty and into the middle class. And what do middle-class people want? Houses, and lots of them. In 1998, China allowed households to buy and sell apartments. With countless millions gaining prosperity over the following years, there was a huge surge in housing demand. The government incentivized home ownership. They relaxed mortgage rules, gave tax benefits, and allowed easy bank lending. Meanwhile, Evergrande's founder, Hui Kaiyan, saw his chance. To get started, he strategically acquired land at favourable prices from local governments, often providing upfront payments and ambitious sales targets for his employees. This approach led to the company's successful IPO in Hong Kong in 2009, and it transformed its founder into a billionaire. From 2010 to 2020, Evergrande's revenue increased year on year. At its peak, Evergrande had a market value of $47 billion and assets worth $353 billion. Its portfolio expanded from residential to include commercial real estate, hotels, resorts, schools, hospitals, sports stadiums, and cultural centres. But all would not remain well for the property giant. A series of events would threaten Evergrande and the stability of the Chinese economy as a whole. Evergrande's growth strategy was straightforward. First, they would borrow money for land acquisition, and then sell these homes to buyers before the homes were even built. They would then use the proceeds to repay lenders and fund the next project. This approach, while lucrative, bore the resemblance of a classic Ponzi scheme, the consequences of which would come back to haunt Evergrande. It was an aggressive, unsustainable expansion strategy. In order to work, it relied heavily on perpetual borrowing, and it worked well for 2 decades, but came at a steep cost. And that cost was a huge amount of debt. But Evergrande's massive debt wasn't its only problem. Betting on property, a national pastime in China, was causing further economic problems to brew beneath the surface. Property ownership is very important in Chinese culture. Some men even deem it necessary to find a life partner. During China's one-child policy, parents sadly preferred to keep only male children. As a result, today, men outnumber women for those in their mid-40s and below. And usually, if a man couldn't afford his own property, their parents would help chip in. Over the past few decades, property demand has been driven, in a small part, due to romantic reasons. As demand for property caused the market to overheat, even more fuel was added to the fire, and this included a lack of other stable investment options in China. Investing in real estate is preferred to stocks or bonds, as it's seen as safer and more profitable. 2. Easy access to credit through online platforms and relaxed lending standards. This helped China's household debt to GDP ratio surge from 18% in 2009 to a staggering 63.3% by March 2023, a 3-fold increase in just 15 years. Number 3. An increasing trend in property speculation. Many investors bought properties in developing areas, intending to sell them later at a higher price. Before long, tiny apartments in Shanghai were fetching Sydney, London, or New York type prices, despite the wages in Chinese cities being much lower. Currently, about 70% of household wealth is invested in real estate. So, thinking that there was more demand than there actually was, Evergrande overbuilt in some areas. But why would they think that there was more people left to buy houses than there actually were? It could be because of this next point. The one-child policy was enacted on faulty data. The literal rocket scientist who calculated the projected population of China, Song Jian, forgot to factor in declining birth rates due to women getting educated and contraceptive proliferation. His predictions ended up being completely wrong, the consequences of which would be very serious. Last year, births in China dropped sharply to 9.56 million. That sounds like a lot, but it's the fewest since 1790. And things just get worse. A 2022 data leak from the records of Shanghai police showed the details of 1 billion Chinese people. The leak is believed to be authentic, and it paints a staggering picture. The population has been overcounted by over 100 million people. To give you an idea of the scale of the problem, the Chinese government 2020 census showed that there were 18.4 million people who were born in 2017, 30% more that were born in 2002. But the 2022 leaked data says that there weren't 30% more people born in this year, but 70% fewer born than in 2002. This isn't just a miscalculation, but a complete demographic disaster in the making. Soon, there's just not going to be enough young people to support the aging generation. Demographer Yi Fuxian has looked closely into China for over a decade. His findings line up squarely with the data leaks, giving them more credibility. In short, Chinese property developers built for a projected population boom, which never happened. And to add to this, youth unemployment has hit 21.3%, making buying a property increasingly hard for the younger generation.
6岁到28岁左右，这些人他们很难找到工作的。你现在有影响吗？你感觉了吗？
对，这个体感是蛮强烈的。这个就是确实是现在就失业率是比较高。
是。
然后呢，因为确实就中国的这个本科毕业生特别多嘛，就大家都觉得自己是大学生，然后有很多工作觉得放不下身段去做。因为我们年轻人确实不像老一辈嘛，他会觉得说自己需要很多的储蓄或者怎么样。年轻人可能观念会更开放一点，觉得自己我可能不会想特别多很往后的事情。
The culmination of all of these factors have created vivid imagery of the problem. Eerily empty concrete husks that dot the skyline in certain regions. While sometimes these developments eventually see habitation, today, more often than not, they sit empty. No sounds of cars or people. Just empty concrete towers, and in some cases, they're completely demolished in one of the most spectacular examples of wasted resources. As both demand for housing and China's population growth have slowed down in recent years, developers like Evergrande are facing even more pressure to sell their properties to repay their debts. But collecting revenue from property sales has been proving harder than first thought. While the housing market was red hot, Xi Jinping was watching with a keen eye. The property sector was getting out of control and action needed to be taken fast. In 2020, Xi Jinping ordered the authorities to implement strict and stringent regulations that would shake Evergrande and China as a whole. These would be known as the famous 3 red lines, a strict debt reduction and financial compliance policy that had one main goal: to reduce the economy's heavy reliance on the property sector, which was now approaching 30% of GDP. Evergrande, as well as many other developers, failed to meet these requirements. They continued to accumulate debt. Evergrande spent huge sums of money on costly land acquisitions and overbuilding during the property market frenzy. Ventures into unrelated sectors such as electric cars and theme parks had little to no profitability. Moreover, the company lacked transparency and engaged in deceptive financial practices, concealing its true debt and cash flow from regulators and investors. All these factors created the perfect storm for Evergrande. By 2021, Evergrande owed over $300 billion. And this was owed to banks, bondholders, suppliers, and investors. To put that into perspective, that is more money than the GDP of Finland or Pakistan. In total, Chinese developers had debts exceeding $5 trillion. Stop and think about that for a second. Throw in the Chinese government's zero-COVID policies, the strictest lockdown in the world, and there was a great level of uncertainty and risk around the property sector. The stage was set. Evergrande announced a trading halt in October 2021. However, it didn't give details on why. The trading suspension lasted for 17 months, and during that period, Evergrande's woes deepened. A liquidity crisis, numerous defaults on bond payments, plunging share prices, and junk ratings from credit agencies. In 2021 alone, the company lost $81 billion. Customers were also disgruntled with their unfinished properties. Investors demanded refunds or compensation. This series of setbacks over the last few years have eroded Evergrande's market value by 99%. From a record high of $42 billion to the company now worth $1 billion today. On August 17, 2023, Evergrande made a final attempt to save itself from collapse by seeking Chapter 15 bankruptcy protection in a New York court. This form of bankruptcy protects the US assets of foreign companies from creditors during debt restructuring in their home country. In doing this, Evergrande hoped to avoid potential legal actions by US bondholders while it facilitated its restructuring process in China. This kind of bankruptcy protection doesn't guarantee a successful debt restructuring or even default avoidance because it still requires approval from Chinese courts and regulators. Another massive Chinese real estate developer, Country Garden, would overtake Evergrande, but they would also instantly trip over. Country Garden lost $7.1 billion in the first 6 months of 2023. Investors concerned about potential debt defaults have sent its stock plummeting. Meanwhile, Evergrande's shares resumed trading on August 27, 2023, 17 months after that trading halt. And it was a disaster.
Increasingly more information about what's happening with restructurings. Of course, the poster child of this is Evergrande. Reported results in the weekend. It's resuming trade today. This one's going through the floor, isn't it?
Yes. It'll, just like many of the other developers that have resumed after a year plus of activity, Evergrande investors have 17 months of news to react to. So since then, we've had $85 billion of losses that Evergrande has reported over the last 2.5 years.
Instantly, there was a massive sell-off, and the stock plunged 87% in just one day. This wiped out $2.2 billion in market value. On September 18, 2023, some arrests were made at Evergrande Financial Wealth Management. It's not clear what the arrests were for, but police have only stated that they were, quote, suspected criminals. The stock fell another 25% on the news. And with that swift decline, it's looking like the once powerful giant has fallen. Evergrande's collapse is unprecedented in Chinese history. It's affected various sectors and people, from iron ore miners to steel and cement producers, home retail businesses, construction workers, and more. As the net worth of Chinese citizens reduces with property prices, spending in local and international markets will decrease. As mentioned in the previous video, if the Australian government doesn't diversify its trading exports, there could be a ripple effect here. The US, Hong Kong, Japan, South Korea, many Western nations in Europe, and the global economy will be affected if current trajectory continues. And remember the middle-class investors that we spoke about earlier in the video? Many of these home buyers now have paid deposits on unfinished properties. It's another issue in this calamity. Evergrande has pre-sold more than 1.4 million homes that have not yet been delivered. Many buyers are families who invested their life savings, and now they risk losing their money on these homes. We may talk a lot about numbers and policy decisions, but this is the true human cost. Overall, new construction is down 24.5% just this year alone. Prices in some areas have fallen by as much as 25% from their October 2021 peaks. The banks and other financial institutions that lent money to Evergrande could face problems of their own. For Evergrande, there's about $20 billion owed to foreign investors. This isn't to mention the Belt and Road Initiative by China, carried out in over 149 different countries. Evergrande was one of the biggest buyers of construction materials. So it's clear to see that with Evergrande's bankruptcy spilling into global markets, the knock-on effects could change the livelihood and well-being of millions of people, not just in China, but overseas. As quoted by Fortune magazine on August 17, 2023, Chinese real estate may be the world economy's most important single sector. So, is this China's Lehman Brothers moment? Well, the answer is not so simple. Yes, both cases involved a highly leveraged and opaque sectors that were critical to the economy and financial system, and both had an element of global risk. However, it's important to note the distinctions. China has an advantage in a state-controlled banking system, though whether you call that an advantage or not depends on your view. Regardless, the Chinese government has already supported the banking sector with liquidity and relaxed some regulations to ease the pressure on the property market. But there's no indication that they're going to bail out Evergrande or any of the other developers that are in trouble. Authorities might even use accounting methods to avoid major bank failures. This opinion was shared by George Mangus, a research associate at Oxford University's China Centre. He states, quote, "In a state banking system, the authorities can move liabilities around the financial system and use extend and pretend accounting to ensure that major banks don't fail and that smaller ones can be made good or managed as necessary. China also has a huge foreign exchange reserve and tight capital flow control. Unlike the United States, which is the world's biggest debtor nation, China is actually the world's biggest creditor nation. But all of this doesn't mean that there's going to be no damage. There are legitimate concerns about the global impacts given the size and influence of China's real estate economy. Right now, it's about damage control, but it's going to take time, maybe even years, to revive the industry. Once consumer sentiment changes so drastically in a housing market, that's hard to bring back. So in conclusion, Evergrande's collapse marks a significant challenge for China. As we look ahead, the stakes are exceptionally high for major industry players in the country. At the same time, it's a tense moment for those whose financial futures are in jeopardy. At this stage, the only things that would stop this from getting worse is government intervention or a stabilization of house prices. On a final note, China does have many state-owned property entities, so it's very possible that they could just take over and stem the bleeding. It's a totally different kind of economy. And with murky data, it's difficult for anyone to provide a concrete analysis. But in saying all of this, as is always the case, this unfolding financial disaster comes down to reckless financial decisions damaging lives. But this time, there's some dodgy government population estimates to go along with it. So what are your thoughts on this matter? Let me know in the comment section below. I'm sure it's going to be a very interesting discussion. Anyway, that's about it from me. My name is Dagogo, and you've been watching ColdFusion. If you want to see anything else on science, technology, or business, feel free to subscribe. It's free. Alright, cheers guys. Have a good one.
ColdFusion. It's new thinking.